He walked into every war like a symbol, forged in loss, lifted by duty, wrapped in an idea too heavy for any man to carry. They called him a hero, a leader, a savior, and he never asked them to stop. He held the shield like it was sacred, like it could block guilt and silence grief. But steel doesn't absolve, and paint can't protect a world from choices made in the dark. Behind every mission, behind every punch, was a man clinging to a version of right that only he could see. They told us he was the heart of the team, but hearts can break, and when his did, he hid it behind principles, behind the illusion of always knowing best. Even when the world screamed for compromise, even when his friends begged for peace, he wasn't corrupted by power, he was consumed by belief. Belief in a world that no longer existed. Belief in a friend who could do no wrong. Belief that his judgment was above question. And when that belief collided with reality, the fallout wasn't just political, it was personal. Civil war wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a collision of pain and pride, of fear and friendship. And at the center was Steve Rogers, a man who thought he was saving freedom, but may have been tearing it apart piece by piece. In this video, we break down the myth of Captain America, and explore how the man who once stood for unity became the force that divided it, how loyalty turned to blindness, how righteousness became ruin, how the true villain of Civil War might have been the one wearing the stars and stripes all along. We were told he was the perfect soldier, the shining symbol of freedom, the man who would never compromise unless it was the right thing to do. But what if that image was never real? What if Steve Rogers wasn't the hero we made him out to be? In the middle of chaos and fear, when the world begged for order, he said no, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't suit his personal belief. He saw compromise as weakness, not as unity, not as growth, not as understanding. While governments pleaded for cooperation, he saw chains. Where others saw safety, he saw control. He refused to sign. Not because it was evil, but because he couldn't let go. He clung to a world where he was always right, even when he wasn't. His loyalty wasn't to the people. It wasn't to peace. It was to a man with blood on his hands, to a friend wrapped in violence and guilt, and he defended him, not because he believed in justice, but because he believed in Bucky. And that's where the truth cracks through the myth. Captain America didn't choose the world. He chose one man over millions, and the consequences would be felt not just in broken buildings, but in shattered ideals. It wasn't just a disagreement over paper and pens. It was a refusal to adapt, to grow with a world that had already changed. Tony tried to bridge the gap. He saw the cost of power unchained, but Steve refused to bend. This wasn't noble. It was stubborn. It was reckless. He didn't ask what the people needed. He decided he knew best. He wielded his shield like it made him untouchable. Like wearing stars and stripes gave him the right to defy the world. Wanda was a child in pain. Vision was still learning what it meant to be. And instead of guiding them with humility, he dragged them into war, into a mess of egos and betrayals. All because he couldn't see past the past. And when the truth came out, when Tony stood broken by what Bucky had done, Steve didn't apologize. He didn't offer understanding. He fought fists over words, silence over responsibility, violence over peace. He didn't just break the Avengers. He broke the trust, the fragile bond that held gods and mortals together. And he did it without blinking, without a moment of doubt, as if the world could be saved by pride alone. The shield once stood for something pure, something bigger than the man who held it. But in Civil War, it became a weapon of defiance, not protection, not justice, just defiance. Steve Rogers was supposed to be the one who knew better, who rose above emotion, who led with empathy, but he lost that. Somewhere between loyalty and rage. He lost the clarity he once carried so effortlessly. Tony didn't need an enemy. He needed a brother. He needed someone to understand the weight of guilt, the fear of another Ultron. But instead he got silence, and fists, and betrayal. Every punch thrown in that Siberian bunker echoed louder than words ever could. They weren't just blows, they were declarations. That Steve no longer stood for all, just for one. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that Steve fought Tony. Not that the Avengers split, but that the symbol of America chose vengeance over healing, and left behind a legacy soaked in cracks. Because even heroes fall, even legends lose their way. And that fall, that descent, reveals something raw, something painfully human. Steve Rogers was never a god. He was a man chasing a world he remembered. Not the one he lived in, and that pursuit, that refusal to let go, it made him dangerous. His ideals were never evil. They were pure, too pure. So pure they became brittle. They couldn't bend. And when the world bent around him, he broke it instead. We watched in awe as he stood against kings and machines, as he lifted hammers and hope. But maybe the greatest power isn't strength, it's surrender. The ability to say, I was wrong. That moment never came. And so the awe we felt turned hollow. Admiration curdled into unease, and the myth of Captain America began to fracture under its own weight. The Sokovia Accords weren't perfect. No one claimed they were. But they were a step, a flawed but necessary step, toward responsibility, toward balance. And they were the only thing holding unchecked power accountable in a world on edge. Steve saw chains where others saw guidance. He mistook defiance for bravery, and in doing so, he planted the seeds of division that would take years to heal. Because every act of rebellion carries a cost, even if it feels righteous in the moment. The world needed unity. It needed the Avengers to be more than weapons, more than myths. It needed them to be accountable. But Steve chose silence, secrecy, and flight. And his silence screamed louder than any speech he ever gave. He didn't just vanish, he took others with him. Fractured a family that once stood together through gods and monsters. And he left the world to pick up the pieces alone. The heroes we once believed in became ghosts, chasing their own truths. In that silence, in that cold choice, Steve Rogers became something he never intended. Not a villain in the traditional sense, but in the way that matters most to those who believed in him, and that betrayal left scars deeper than any war. Legends aren't built on perfection, they're built on choices. And the ones Steve made during Civil War tore more than just alliances apart. They tore at the soul of heroism itself. Because when myth becomes man, we're left with consequences, not comfort. And sometimes the cost of being a symbol is forgetting you're still human underneath it all. He wasn't evil, he wasn't cruel, but he was blind. Blinded by the past, by friendship, by a sense of duty twisted into obsession. And that blindness cost everything. Because even good men can cause chaos when they refuse to see the full picture. And Steve's unwavering heart became the very thing that fractured everything he swore to protect. Civil War wasn't about villains and heroes. It was about a man who believed so deeply in his own righteousness that he forgot how to listen, how to see, how to trust. And that kind of certainty is more dangerous than any enemy from the outside. Because when you refuse to question yourself, you become the thing you once fought against. In choosing Bucky, he lost Tony. In rejecting the Accords, he lost the people. In holding that shield, he lost what it meant. Because you can't carry a symbol and ignore what it stands for. And a symbol without meaning is just metal and memory. And when symbols shatter, they don't just fall, they bury everything beneath them. And that's the tragedy of Captain America. Not that he fell, but that he never knew he did. He thought he was saving freedom. But sometimes, the real villain is the one who believes they're the only one who's right, and never looks back to see the damage left behind. And in the silence that followed, all that remained was a fractured world and a forgotten ideal.